This is an extraordinary story, not only because of the number of victims, but also due to the negligence, gross errors, and sheer human cruelty. I want to remind you that this story should be viewed at the discretion of the viewer. In the 70s, the USSR saw a peak in tourism. Borders were closed at the time, but people always wanted adventures and journeys. To the songs of Vysotsky, people went on hikes into forests and mountains. Wild and dangerous tourism began acquiring civilized features. Official routes appeared, marked trails where guides led tourists. Tourism became accessible to everyone, and not only seasoned tourists, but also ordinary people unrelated to tourism began hiking. The 30th All-Union route is otherwise called Through the Mountains to the Sea. It starts from the village of Kzhok and ends in Dagomis, located on the Black Sea coast. This route was considered easy as even children's groups used it. It was very crowded, well-trodden paths, equipped camps, many tourist bases, all conditions for the rest of the common people. Due to the number of people on this route, it wasn't popular among professionals. After all, the route goes through the mountains, and mountains don't like to be disregarded. The group in question was numbered 93. The group consisted of 53 people. To be honest, it's a very large group that requires good organization and high qualifications of guides. The company was very mixed. There were people from all corners of the Soviet Union. People went to relax, eat food cooked over a campfire, and drink to the sound of a guitar by the fire. Mostly these were people very far from tourism. For many, it was their first tourist experience. Everything started wonderfully. The group was settled for 5 days at a tourist base under the guidance of an experienced guide, Alex Sergeyev. He took the group on small and short training hikes and prepared them for the upcoming big hike. However, according to eyewitnesses, besides walking around the surroundings, many in the group were actively drinking. You can't blame them. As mentioned above, most of these people were far from tourism and came only for the hangout. Some interest groups formed during the first 5 days. It's understandable. 53 strangers cannot quickly become friends and communicate with each other. Therefore, the group split by interests. Then a series of fatal mistakes began. Alexei Agiv, having stayed with the group and, so to speak, trained them, left for his main job. He was a teacher and the new school year had started. Agev left the group to his 2 assistants, Alexei Safonov and Olga Kovaleva. Both Alexei and Olga were merely students of the Donetsk Agricultural Institute. They had very little tourist experience and no experience in leading tourist groups at all. On the route, they were supposed to lead the large group of over 50 people. Alexei and Olga were on their second time. Many participants were much older than them, so there was real authority. But there was a lack of guides, so they had to appoint whoever was available. On the morning of September 9th, 1975, the tourists, having received food supplies at the Caucasus base, set off on the main route: Caucasus base, Terpel shelter, Fisht shelter, Babuk Owl shelter, Salok Owl shelter, Dagomis village. Dividing the tourists into 2 groups, Alexei and Olga decided to follow a new route variant proposed that year: Guzeripal, White Valley, Teplak shelter, Eastern Alpine of Mount Guzeripal. The group followed this route according to plan and settled for a scheduled overnight stay. Campfire, festive dinner of the first day's songs with a guitar, and, according to eyewitnesses, a large amount of alcohol. One of the event's eyewitnesses, Boris Kolosov, recalled, "The day before the move to Fisht, they were celebrating someone's birthday. They had a good time, no discipline. The instructors let everything slide. Evening, night, the party didn't stop. Many fell asleep only at dawn." The state of people the next day was, of course, what you'd expect. A deep hangover, no appetite, feeling nauseous. Someone even drank more to feel better. Ahead was an ascent over several kilometers.
According to the plan, The group was supposed to leave early in the morning. Naturally, the guides couldn't rouse the group at dawn and feed them. That morning, they lost 3 hours, which played a tragic role. The weather was bad from the start. Clouds, a leaden sky. But despite the weather conditions, the guides decided to proceed with the route. After breakfast, the group set out towards the fished shelter. The crossing was easy. Usually, tourists completed it in an hour. But this group stretched out significantly, naturally were not at all lively after the previous night's festivities. Moreover, the weather began to worsen rapidly. It became cold and it started raining. The path ascended, and the stones were slippery, slowing the movement of the already not-so-fast group. According to eyewitnesses, the air smelled of snow. And indeed, after some time, snow began falling, the temperature dropped sharply, and a forceful wind arose. People who arrived in the warm Caucasus during the velvet season were not prepared for such weather. Moreover, the tourists had already left the forest zone, which somewhat sheltered them from the wind, and entered the alpine zone, where there was nowhere to hide. From the testimony of tourist Lyudmila Kosyakova, everything happened suddenly. The light rain didn't foreshadow a storm, even when it turned to wet snow. Suddenly, a wind of such strength arose that it was impossible to stand on one's feet. Within minutes, one of our tourists, Felix Shinov, was blown away like a feather. We saw him fly quickly across the plain, and he was carried into the abyss. He didn't even have time to scream. Soon, due to the clouds and snow, one couldn't see even 2 steps. Panic seized us. Visibility was practically zero. The group was very stretched out. Some moved forward, others sought shelter, and some, exhausted, just sat down and froze. Many years later, Boris Kolosov recalled, "We stretched into a long chain. The group continued moving along the eastern slopes of Mount Guzaripal. When the blizzard rose and the path was no longer visible, the group stopped. Visibility was zero, no more than 2 to 3 meters. The wind drowned out the cries of the instructors trying to gather 50 people. Panic began in the group. Throughout the time spent together, people didn't become a united team, but made friends in small groups. And so, by 3s, 5s, they tried to survive." With tremendous effort, the guides managed to gather the group, and they began discussing what to do next. Moreover, they discussed this with members of the tourist group who had no experience, and many were in a state of panic. And this was the middle of the trail, under hurricane winds, amidst a snowstorm with freezing people. They couldn't decide whether to continue to the fished shelter, wait out the storm in the forest, or return to the Teplak shelter. Doubts sowed discord in the group, and conflict arose. One option was to return to the forest zone. After all, they had just left it. It was only 300 meters to the forest. The option was to move towards fished, forward. There was also a forest zone there, but they needed to cross a stream with the colorful name Graveyard. They argued for quite a while. During this time, some group members, banding together, began doing what they deemed necessary. In the end, the guides decided to return, but the group split, and time was lost. Some groups had strong guys with military backgrounds. These guys decided not to go back but to go forward, where the nearest forest was 500 meters away. New leaders emerged, more authoritative than the student guides. Part of the tourists followed these new leaders up the slope. With the guides, only 20 people went to the shepherd's hut, which they recently passed. In the blizzard, tourists lost each other. The hurricane drowned out their voices and their feet slipped on. It seemed the goal was close when Semyon Duzhansky fell into the abyss. He miraculously got stuck on a tiny ledge. Behind him was a steep, almost polished rock, and beneath him a deep chasm. "Senya!" His friend Nikolai Zagansky shouted, "I'm coming." "Don't, Kolya," Duzhansky replied. "You'll bury me and fall yourself. When you settle, throw me a rope." "Okay, Senya," Zagansky shouted. "We'll light a fire and pull you up. Just hold on, Senya." "I'll hold on," came from below. "Don't worry, I'll hold on." The guide detachment's descent took an hour and a half. In the end, this part of the group reached the shepherd's hut, where shepherds helped them. One of the instructors, Olga Kovaleva, went blind from the snowstorm. The second instructor, Alexei, went in search of the missing, but he only managed to find 3. The shepherds inside the hut had only one pair of boots between them, but they also went searching and brought back a few more people. Shepherd Vitaly Ostretsov brought 2 girls to the hut and the guys to pull out another girl who had lost and was lying in a deep gully. However, none of the guys responded to his request. The shepherd, exhausted, continued his search and found 2 more tourists under a fir tree who already had no strength to reach the hut. Then he returned to the hut and almost forcibly pushed 2 strong guys, ordering them to bring the freezing tourists to the hut. The guys went, stood for some time at a distance, and returned, saying they didn't find anyone under the fir tree. The shepherd continued searching and found another separated group of tourists. From the tourists' memories, we couldn't wait to get to warmth. Frostbitten, exhausted, we lagged behind. Ostretsov restrained us, demanding help for those who lagged behind. He was not listened to. People rushed forward. "Guys, don't leave me." With no strength left, Dina Neyman whispered faintly. She couldn't move at all. Foam came from her mouth. "For the sake of the children, I have 2. Nearby were engineer Mikhail Reshkin and mechanician Sokolov, and also Vladimir Treti, a teacher from one of the schools. It was he who said, "Dina, don't be afraid, we won't leave you. Lie down for a bit, we will come soon." They dashed forward quickly, and they did not arrive. Having reached the hut, they crawled under a blanket and soon fell asleep. Besides Dina, 3 more people died on the way to the hut. If we had helped everyone, there would have been more corpses, Sokolov would say during the investigation. The leaders who split the group managed to reach the forest zone and light a fire. Those who had the strength to reach the fire survived. The rest, exhausted and disoriented in the blizzard, scattered along the steep slopes of the Mogilny ravine. For a long time, the strong guys sitting by the warm fire heard pleas for help from the dying people around them. Thus, the people who followed the new leaders remained on the mountainside, one-on-one with the harsh elements. The leaders spent the night by the fire. In the morning, after breakfast, they went to the tourist base as if nothing had happened. In the group of 50 people, there were not only scoundrels. While Alex Staroselsky pushed the weak away from the fire, Vitaly Galushko, with frostbitten hands, chopped branches for the same fire and, chilled to the bone, gave his sleeping bag to the girls. When Reshkin, Sokolov and Tretyakov abandoned Dina, worker Valery Nikitenkov carried her and another tourist, Zoya, on his back. When he was exhausted, 17-year-old cook Igor Kolyada from Dnepropetrovsk took over. He stayed with them until the last moment. The fate of the tourists found under the fir tree by the shepherd was as follows. They turned out to be Svetlana Vetriarkush and Mikhail Osipenko. Svetlana, firmly believing that someone would come for her, fought the elements alone for 3 days and survived. She survived on hope and faith that someone would reach her. Soaked to the skin, without warm clothes, matches, fire or food, she built a shelter from branches and ferns under a huge fir tree. Around the fir tree, she made a path in the deep snow and kept moving, not allowing herself to freeze. Only on September 13th, seeing the rescue helicopter, did she leave her shelter and, silently crying, began to climb the slope towards the rescuers. She was the only one the rescuers found alive. The group that got into trouble was numbered 93. At the shepherd's hut, they were met by group number 94, which was following them. By that time, part of the group that had suffered the disaster had already gathered there. But group number 94 turned around and went back to the tourist base without even informing the rescuers about the tourists from group number 93. The rescue operation started late. Firstly, no one informed them about the tourists. Secondly, they started searching in a completely different place. Thirdly, the victims waited for rescuers for more than 3 days, and many simply did not wait and froze. Then the terrible discoveries began. According to one of the rescuers, a guy is lying with a guitar, in a t-shirt, a windbreaker, and with a smile on his face. Others are about the same. Everyone is lightly dressed. When they started inspecting the backpacks, it turned out that each had warm socks, sweaters, and plenty of food, and there was a whole forest of firewood. The reason for their deaths was not particularly indicated anywhere. Almost all the tourists were drunk. They were warming themselves with vodka. As a result, 21 people from the group died, but many were injured and suffered severe frostbite. In the USSR, this tragedy was not publicized. There were only a few insignificant lines in the newspaper. Then there was a trial. The directors of the tourist bases were given several years. They wanted to sentence the meteorologist for not predicting this terrible storm, but it turned out that he did not have the necessary equipment and could not predict it. Guides Alexei and Olga were witnesses in this case. Since they were not official guides, they could not lead this group. Accordingly, they were not held criminally responsible. And those guys who pushed the freezing people away from the fire were not judged, citing a state of affect. Such a tragic story. About ordinary people who treated the mountains with disdain, the weather without caution, and their work negligently. As a result, they showed their true faces. Thank you for your attention. I wish you all the best. With love to you. Take care of yourselves and your loved ones. Do not go on hikes if you are not confident in your abilities. See you in the next video.